Okay, this video is going to roughly summarize the traditional Catholic movement, roughly beginning in the early 20th century up through today. So the reason I'm making this video is there are multiple people watching my videos who have heard me talk about traditional Catholicism before, and they've asked for more information on it. And I tried directing them to other resources, but then it came to my attention that while there are many videos or podcasts or whatnot on detailed specifics relating to traditional Catholicism, for example, there will be a very in-depth YouTube video on Vatican II. There isn't really any map that lays out the full guideline of exactly what happened before, during, and after Vatican II and how that kind of resulted in the quote-unquote traditional Catholic movement. So that's what this video is going to cover. Okay, so starting off in the early 20th century, that's when the liberalism and modernism kind of started to first seep into the church. There were the Freemasonic documents leaked, which explained how they intended to desensitize society to anything that was kind of evil. They explained how they were going to try to go after the youth and try to make the youth a little more immoral. They said they were going to try to avoid trying to convince old people of this because the older people were already so steeped in their ways that they weren't going to change their minds, but the young people would be susceptible. There were a couple different things that they mentioned that they wanted to achieve, though listing them all here would take too long. Suffice to say, they wanted to promote communism. They wanted to tear down the family structure, especially marriage. They wanted actually to increase immodesty in society. So they said, for example, I think it was the communists who said they were going to take the women's sleeves from the wrist to the elbow, from the elbow to the shoulder, and then, of course, with just the immodest swimmer alone that came out, they achieved far more than they could ever have possibly hoped for in that regard. So St. Pius X was kind of instrumental in fighting against modernism in its early stages, but there was only really so much that he could do. And then the communists decided to try to start infiltrating the Catholic Church, and that was pretty much that. Bella Dodd, in her School of Darkness, she was a prominent communist official in America working for the Communist Party. She recounted that the communists actually managed to get well over 1,000 communists into the American seminaries alone. And think about what that means. Okay, first off, not only are you getting 1,000 communists into the seminaries, but that also means that if any of those seminarians are later on priests in high-ranking positions of authority or bishops, they're going to help promote the other communists to places of power. So, for example, let's say Communist A becomes a bishop somewhere, and the Pope asks him, oh, in the neighboring diocese, I have to appoint another bishop. Who would you suggest? The bishop is just going to suggest another fellow communist, and that's what happened throughout large portions of America. You also began to see problems with the pedophile priests. There was a letter sent out to many bishops saying, if anybody is suspected of being a pedophile, do not ordain him a priest. Do not let him become a priest. Of course, many of the communist bishops who wanted to do just about anything that would help tear down the Catholic Church completely ignored that and ordained pedophiles left and right. And that is actually a large part of the reason why the pedophilia problem in the church was so big for so long, is because the communists just kept ordaining all of these priests who were known pedophiles. But anyway, on towards Vatican II. So leading up to Vatican II, not everybody in the church was liberal, but there was definitely a very kind of liberal mindset going around. It was very strong. Vatican II itself was a very shady event, so to speak. And if I went into everything that was shady about Vatican II, I could speak for hours and this video would go on forever. So suffice to say, there were many carefully well-prepared documents that had been laid out years in advance for Vatican II, and they were completely chucked aside at the last minute. When the priest who had helped prepare the documents went up on stage in front of the council to beg them all to reconsider and use his documents, somebody cut off his mic. So that's just one kind of shady little thing that happened. Also, some of the bishops several hundred of the bishops actually signed a petition asking for communism to be discussed and eventually denounced at the council. And they submitted that petition and hoped that it would make its way up into the proper circles, but they later found out that that petition had mysteriously disappeared, and nobody was really quite sure what happened to it, so they weren't really going to discuss communism at all. And Vatican II is just chock full of those little shady things happening everywhere. Now, suffice to say, Vatican II was a pastoral council, not a doctrinal council. So what that basically means is that Vatican II is not held to be infallible, and Catholics are not commanded to believe it. So what many people will say is, oh, well, you're disobeying Vatican II. Well, no, Vatican II was a suggestion. It was not something that you are obligated to accept no matter what. So what exactly did Vatican II say or do that was somewhat problematic? Let's get into it. There's three main portions that were kind of problematic aside from the traditional mass, which will be covered shortly. So the first problem was the problem of ecumenism. So for those of you who don't know, ecumenism is basically the idea that God is a-okay with all religions. He just might happen to slightly prefer some above others. And you don't necessarily need to become a Catholic in order to be saved. So the Catholic Church is always taught, outside of the Catholic Church, there is no salvation. The Catholic Church is the only one true church. All other religions are false religions. So that means Protestantism is a false religion. Anglicanism is a false religion. Hinduism is a false religion. Any pagan religion is a false religion. Islam is a false religion, and so on and so forth. The Catholic Church is the only one true religion. Vatican II basically didn't outright say that the other religions were a-okay, but it kind of slyly hinted that God was a-okay with the other religions in existing. They didn't necessarily say, oh yeah, these religions are definitely valid, but Vatican II did say, we should accept these religions. You know, God is okay with these other religions. He's okay with Protestantism. He's okay with Anglicanism and so on and so forth. He just happens to maybe slightly prefer Catholicism above all the others. But, you know, you shouldn't try to convert these people to Catholicism. You should let them stay where they are. So for a more concrete modern day example of this, there's a very famous exorcist on YouTube named, I think his name is Father Vincent Lampert. And something he says in some of his talks is when people come to him and say, oh, Father, I think I'm possessed, the correct response, the thing that you're supposed to do according to the Catholic Church's teachings, is you're supposed to be examined to see if you are possessed, and then if you are possessed, a Catholic priest is supposed to start performing the rite of exorcism over you. Now, what Father Vincent Lampert said was, oh, okay, well, if you think that you're being possessed, don't come to a priest if you're not a Catholic. If you're not a Catholic and you're, say, a Jew, don't go to a Catholic priest. Instead, go to your rabbi. If you're a Protestant and you think you're possessed, don't go to a Catholic priest. Go instead to your minister or your pastor or the head of your local little church wherever you attend. So that's really what ecumenism is, and ecumenism was widely propagated in Vatican II. Now, the second problem was religious liberty. Vatican II endorsed religious liberty. Now, for those of you who haven't heard that the Catholic Church was against religious liberty, you're probably going to be shocked to hear this, but the Catholic Church has always taught that religious liberty was wrong. The Catholic Church has always taught that a country should not have a neutral religion. A country should be firmly and officially Catholic. So the idea of separation of church and state, for example, has always been condemned by the Catholic Church. So yes, for example, in America, that would mean, ideally, if the Catholic Church's teachings were being followed, that Catholicism would be declared the official religion of the United States of America, and any laws which went against the Catholic Church's laws would be completely condemned. So, for example, abortion would be out because it goes against the Catholic Church's laws. Divorce, at least divorce without annulments or divorce without, due cause. So, for example, if like the wife is being beaten by her husband, then they might let them separate or something like that. But if some wife just decides, I find my husband kind of boring, I'm going to divorce him, yeah, that would be completely illegal in a Catholic country that officially accepted Catholicism as the religion of the country. And you can complain about that. You can say, oh, well, I don't think it should be that way. It doesn't matter what you think. That's what the Catholic Church has always taught. So the Catholic Church has always taught religious liberty is wrong, and Catholicism needs to be the official religion of the country. Vatican II said religious liberty is a-okay, and you all need to bend your views on it and be more lenient. Now, the third problem with Vatican II was collegiality. This one is a little more tricky to understand, but basically the idea was previously that the Pope, he wasn't necessarily a king, but he was kind of a steward, and he definitely outranked everybody else. So, for those of you who have read the Lord of the Rings books, imagine that Jesus is Aragorn, kind of. He's the king of Minas Tirith, and the Pope is supposed to be kind of like a steward, so he's supposed to fulfill Denethor or Faramir's place right there. And what the bishops at Vatican II said was, actually, the Pope isn't really in charge of us, and he doesn't really get to tell us what to do. Instead, we will all vote on what happens. So the Catholic Church is really a monarchy when you think about it. The Pope is kind of the steward for the king, and the king is Jesus Christ, and the bishops are kind of like the nobles. Now, what the bishops of Vatican II kind of tried to do is they kind of tried to shift it from being a monarchy into being more of a democracy. And they said, oh, well, the Pope doesn't really get to tell us what's right and wrong anymore. Instead, we're just going to vote on what's right and wrong. So if, say, 51 bishops vote yes and 49 bishops vote no, then that's how we're going to make all of our decisions from now on. And instead of having the Pope run things, we're just going to start having bishops' councils run things. So that was a problem with Vatican II that many of the traditional Catholics didn't like. And you could actually see this. A good symbolism of this was the papal tiara. So for those of you who don't know, the Pope used to wear a hat called a papal tiara. It looked kind of like a bishop's mitre, except it was often plated in gold and looked far fancier. You probably, if you've looked at photos of Pope Francis or Pope Benedict XVI, you've never seen them wearing that, and it's because right around Vatican II, I think Paul VI, they completely stopped wearing that. John Paul II never wore it. And that was because the papal tiara was kind of the Pope's crown in a certain sense. It was the symbol of his authority. And when the Pope stopped wearing that because of the endorsement of collegiality by Vatican II, that was kind of a symbolism of the Pope being uncrowned in a certain sense. He didn't have the same authority that he kind of once had, or at least they didn't recognize that he did. So that was the third problem with Vatican II. The fourth problem with Vatican II was the traditional Mass. So Vatican II in and of itself didn't get rid of the traditional Mass, but they did create the Concilium Council, which did. And there were a lot of really shady things going on with the Concilium, which I think I'd have to read a bit more. But suffice to say, for those of you who don't know, the original Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, was slowly shifted and made over several hundred years. So it wasn't as if somebody sat down one day, casually wrote out a paper form for it, and boom, the traditional Mass came into effect. They slowly designed that Mass over several hundred years. And what many people like to say, because there was a document named Pro Quimum that came out that enshrined the traditional Mass, it codified it, and what many people like to say is, oh, the traditional Mass actually isn't that old, it was only made when Pro Quimum came out. And no, that's not true. The traditional Mass had been around for hundreds of years before that point. Pro Quimum only codified it and made sure that it would stay enshrined. We'll get back to Quo Primum a little bit later, but suffice to say, the Concilium was very shady. So, for example, Bugnini, that was the name of the secretary of the Concilium who kind of headed its affairs. His first name was Annibale, by the way. Annibale means son of Baal. So the guy overseeing the overhaul of the traditional Mass was literally named the son of Baal, which is kind of creepy, and it came out later that he was a Freemason. So Bugnini would often propose very radical changes be made to the Mass, and whenever the other priests on the Concilium would protest these changes, Bugnini would just shake his finger at them and say, oh, but the Pope wants these changes. It's the Holy Father's wish. And for those of you who aren't Catholic who don't know, many of the priests have this kind of mindset that if the Pope wants something, he gets it. So all Bugnini really had to say was, oh, well, the Pope wants these changes to be made, and the rest of the priests would immediately back down. So fast forward something weeks later, and the priests actually found out that the Pope had been actually opposing these changes the whole time, because they hadn't been talking to the Pope, only Bugnini had. And because Bugnini would walk into the Pope's office and say, okay, Holy Father, here are the changes that the Concilium has proposed. What do you think of them? And the Pope would say, oh, well, these seem kind of radical. Can't you tune it back a little bit? And Bugnini would say, oh, but Holy Father, all of the priests agreed on this. They all want it. You're the only person who's ever expressed any doubts about it. And the Pope would say, oh, well, I have to be humble. If the rest of the priests all think these radical changes are necessary, then I'll go along with them. So Bugnini had been kind of playing the Pope and the Concilium against each other to get the results the Freemasons ultimately wanted. Now, the second problem with the Mass in and of itself was that it was designed largely by Protestant ministers. They actually called in, I believe it was six Protestant ministers to oversee and write the designs for the new Mass. And Bugnini himself put it, he said, anything that could form a shadow of a stumbling block for the Protestants needs to be cut out of the Mass. Okay, so what does that mean? It really means that what Bugnini and the Freemasons were trying to do was transform the traditional Latin Mass, which was unapologetically Catholic, into something that very much resembled a Protestant Sunday service. So, okay, what does that mean? So, for one, the Mass was in Latin, which we later saw was kind of removed. That was done away with. The Mass was then said in the vernacular. But one big aspect that the Protestants really hated was the idea that we needed to ask Jesus to make us holier and to wash away our sins, especially in confession and whatnot. Because the Protestants believe that once Jesus died, he saved you and there's nothing else we can do about it, whereas the Catholics believe that you have to keep on trying to become holy. Now, the traditional Mass, for those of you who haven't attended it or haven't read the rubrics, is chock full of prayers asking God to get rid of people's sins or defects and help make them holier. And for those of you who have attended the New Order Mass and are thinking, oh, well, the New Order Mass does that too. It doesn't do it anywhere even close to the level that the traditional Mass does. Like every other prayer is something like, God, we are sinful, please help us improve in this virtue. I think Father Chad Ripperger said that the rubrics for the new Mass usually go something very roughly along the lines of, oh God, you are so big, help us, whereas the prayers for the traditional Latin Mass are very specific. And he mentioned the specificity because he said if you use very general, broad, vague prayers during exorcisms, because Father Ripperger is an exorcist, the prayers don't actually work that well. On the other hand, if you use very specific, direct, concise, detailed prayers during the exorcisms, then the exorcisms generally tend to work better. And Father Ripperger says God likes specificity. The new Mass is not very specific. It's very kind of broad and vague in its prayers, whereas the prayers in the traditional Latin Mass are very specific and to the point. Okay, now another big change in the traditional Mass was that the priest would no longer face towards the altar. He would actually face towards the people. So what's the importance of that? Okay, so Catholic churches were always built facing towards the east because it says that when Jesus was crucified on the cross, his face was towards the west. So the idea is that all of the Catholics, when they go to church and they kneel down to pray, are kind of facing towards the direction of Jesus' face on Calvary, where he was crucified on the cross. Not only that, but the tabernacle is often built into the east side of the church. So what happens is that the priest is actually facing towards the tabernacle. In fact, in most actually traditional churches, if you go there, the altar will be built right into the side of the wall, and the tabernacle itself is actually built above the altar. So the priest actually has to reach across the altar to get into the tabernacle. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that during the entire Mass, the priest is quite literally staring straight at God, straight at Jesus himself, across in the entire time during the Mass. In fact, during the traditional Latin Mass, the priests and the altar servers are not allowed to walk straight down off the altar. They actually have to walk away at an angle off the altar. The reason being is nobody's allowed to turn their back on God. That was a very firm point that the traditional Catholics had. Nobody was allowed to turn their back on God. And if you've ever been to adoration in a Catholic church and you've seen people walking kind of backwards when they leave adoration, or they've kind of been walking sideways and they never quite fully turn their back towards the exposed host, that's why, because Catholics do not turn their back on the Eucharist. They don't turn their backs on God. That's a big factor. Now, the new Mass that Bugnini and the Freemasons and the Protestants were designing completely got rid of that. That was gone. Now the priest would be facing straight towards the people, and he would have his back towards the altar, his back towards the tabernacle if the tabernacle was directly behind him. And this is why Father Ripperger said that he could never say the New Order Mass. He said, it's not modest, it's not proper to turn your back on God, so I can never do that. Now, not only was the priest now turning his back towards God, but he was actually showing his face towards the people. So here's the question. In the traditional Latin Mass, who does the priest choose to turn his face towards? God, which means that God outranks the people and God is more important than the people. In the New Order Mass, who is the priest turning his face towards? Well, he's turning his face towards the people. Who is he turning his back towards? God. So does that mean that technically the priest thinks that the people are of a higher importance than God? And a lot of people say, oh, that's reading too deep into the details, that's a little too far. You have to understand that the traditional Latin Mass is chock full of symbolism. They took these kinds of things very, very seriously. Every little detail is meticulously mapped out. There's even a specific way that the priest has to wash his hands before he goes into the traditional Mass. There's actually a specific way that the altar servers at the traditional Latin Mass have to lay out the priest's vestments. They actually have to make an M or an S. They have to make sure that they're not bending the gold, etc. It's a very meticulously detailed process. The New Order Mass completely obliterated all of that. It was now out the window. Now in the New Order Mass, the altar servers do not prepare the priest's vestments at all. The priest just leaves them hanging in a closet and casually shrugs them on before Mass. So yeah, just to kind of give you an idea, everything that was holy or sacred or whatnot about the Latin Mass was completely stripped aside. I could go on about this for hours, but suffice to say, the changes were really quite insulting, to say the least. And when the new Mass was actually rolled out at Vatican II, when they presented the rubrics for it to the bishops there, many of the bishops, I think roughly about 50% of them, were actually quite horrified. One of the bishops stood up and politely said, "Thank you all for your input. I would like to thank the Concilium for making this for us, but I must say now that it's quite clear to me that most of you were never parish priests, because if you were parish priests, you would know that implementing this new Mass is going to reduce the churches to be full of nothing but women and children. The men are never going to attend this kind of Mass." Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who headed the traditional faction at the council, said that this kind of Mass was not going to attract a single Protestant to the faith as the people kept hoping it would, but it was going to cause countless Catholics to lose the faith and possibly even convert to Protestantism, because they would say, what's the difference? This prayer service thing on Sundays doesn't even look anything like Catholic Mass, so why should we convert to Catholicism? And that was actually true. I actually had a Protestant friend one time who attended, back when I went to the New Order Mass, who attended the Catholic Mass, and I said, "Oh, are you going to convert to Catholicism now?" And he said, "What's the difference? It looks exactly the same as the Protestant prayer service that I usually attend on Sundays. There's nothing different here." That was really the goal that the Freemasons were aiming for. They wanted to make it look like Catholicism and Protestantism and all the other religions were exactly the same. Remember the goal of ecumenism? Traditional Catholicism is not better than any of the other religions. It's not the right religion. It's not the true religion. It's just one religion among many. And so eventually the changes to the traditional Mass were in fact passed, and they were implemented, they were rolled out, and priests were told, okay, now you're going to be saying the New Order Mass from now on, the traditional Latin Mass is history. It's not going to take pride of place anymore. You need to start shifting over. The seminarians were also told, you're not going to be allowed to say the traditional Mass. From now on, it's the New Order Mass for you. Now, after Vatican II and the new Mass were rolled out, things in the Catholic Church started getting pretty weird, to say the least. So, for one thing, Vatican II's rules had been so lenient and lax that it seemed pretty much just about anything could be permissible by their standards, as long as it wasn't traditional. So, for example, communion in the hand, which had previously been some kind of emergency thing only required on special occasions, was now completely in practice everywhere. People started getting the Eucharist just dropped into their hands like they were receiving a cookie or something like that. For those of you who don't understand why that's such a big deal, previously, because only things that were consecrated were allowed to touch the host of Jesus. So the priest's hands were anointed at his ordination. All of the things such as the chalice that the host was stored in, those were specifically consecrated for that. Receiving the Eucharist on the tongue, actually at people's baptisms, as during the traditional baptism, which Vatican II helped get rid of, by the way. The people's tongue, the baby's tongues or the infant's tongues, or even the adult's tongues, would actually be exorcised with blessed salt in order to kind of purify the tongue to receive the host on it. Now, most lay people's hands, the faithful lay faithful, they have not been purified. They've never been consecrated. They've never been blessed. They've never been whatever. So people were now receiving the Eucharist casually on a section of their body that was completely unfit to receive the Eucharist. So that's just kind of another small example of another very important detail of the Catholic religion that was kind of chipped away at during Vatican II. And these kind of things started happening everywhere. altar rails in churches. Previously, the altar had been separated from the lay faithful by a rail, and people would kneel at that rail to receive communion. That was done away with. Now everybody could go up and down of the altar. So the priest's role as kind of the nobleman interceding for the people on behalf of God was stripped away. Now he was just kind of friendly old pastor so-and-so instead of a person with real authority and importance in the church. And also now anybody could go up on the altar. That's when you started having women and men who were not priests or whatever going up on the altar in the middle of Mass to read the gospel as if they actually had permission to set foot on the altar, which they did not, or they should not have been allowed to anyway. You had many other strange masses occur. So for example, there were clown masses, there were nude masses, there were masses where the priest would dance, there were balloon masses, there were party masses, there were cheesehead masses, there were football masses, there were basketball masses, there were guitar masses. It just went on and on and on. You started having some weird things happen in the church. And for those of you who are thinking, oh, I'm sure those were just a couple isolated incidents, that didn't happen very often, and if it did happen, I'm sure their bishop quickly corrected them on that, you are painfully naive. These things happened everywhere, and the bishops did nothing when they heard about them. If somebody had like a nude mass in a church somewhere, the bishop would just turn a blind eye. If a priest somewhere celebrated a traditional Latin mass, the bishop would immediately spring into action and quickly slap them down. So if you're a traditional Catholic during this point in time, very quickly, or somebody who has kind of traditional tendencies, suffice to say, you're going to start developing a certain dislike for most of the bishops and most of the people in the Vatican. So the Catholic Church started to kind of split here. You had people who kind of loved the worldliness and whatnot, and you had people who didn't. So for example, Padre Pio, I'm sure most of you know who Padre Pio is, very famous. He actually complained one time because there was, I think it was a cardinal who visited him, and the cardinal said, oh, but you know, Father, we need to make all of these changes to help attract the youth and whatnot, because the youth don't like, you know, the tonsure that they have to get when they enter religious orders. They don't like all the rules. We need to help kind of break down some of these harsh, strict rules so that people will feel more welcome. And Padre Pio basically said something along the lines of, this isn't some kind of punishment. This is, you know, this is just how the rules are, and they should consider themselves grateful that they get to follow these rules in order to save their soul. They shouldn't complain about it. Padre Pio was notoriously very strict in this regard, especially around this time frame. So, for example, one of the things that Padre Pio was very famous for, which has kind of been forgotten, it's not really mentioned in any of the New Order books anymore, is he was very big on modesty. So what does that mean? One, that means if you're going into Padre Pio's confessional, your entire body has to be covered. So what does that mean? If a man tried to go into Padre Pio's confessional wearing shorts, Padre Pio would kick them out. If a man tried to go into Padre Pio's confessional wearing a t-shirt, Padre Pio would kick them out. Why? Because if you're going to the confessional, you need to have your legs covered down to your ankles and your arms covered up to your wrists, man or woman, no exceptions. So for example, if a woman tried to go in wearing like a quarter-length sleeve or something like that, or a sleeve that only came down to her elbow, Padre Pio would kick them out. I'm willing to bet if you're a conciliar Catholic who attends a Novus Ordo church, you've never heard about this before, this side of Padre Pio, but it's true. You can look it up for yourself. That also means that Padre Pio did not allow women to wear pants or skirts that were too short. If a woman was wearing a dress or a skirt that only came down to her knees, Padre Pio kicked her out. And he would tell her, don't come back until you've got a dress that goes down to your feet. There was actually, I believe it was a lady from Canada who came to visit Padre Pio, and she owned a clothing store and she was wearing pants. And Padre Pio actually told her, you need to go burn all of those pants right now. You cannot get rid of them. You can't do anything. And I'm not giving you absolution until you do. That's correct. He literally refused to give absolution to a woman who was wearing pants and owned a clothing store that sold pants until she burned that clothing shop. Again, like I said before, I'll say it again. If you're a Novus Ordo Catholic who's never attended a traditional Latin Mass, chances are you have never heard that story in all your life. And this is something that really kind of came into play here. Any traditional side or aspect of the saints or after Vatican II was kind of pushed aside or hidden or whatnot. So you'd hear about how such and such saint loved Jesus, he was so full of love and he was so full of mercy and kindness and whatnot. You'd never hear about any of the strict things that they did. So for example, I forget if it was Saint Alphonsus or Saint Francis de Sales. I was reading his book and he literally said, you should not go to mass, or no, not mass. Sorry, a horrible mistake there. You should not go to dances. He was telling the young people don't go to dances, and he did not say you shouldn't go to immodest dances or whatnot. He literally said any kind of dance. Doesn't matter whether it's immodest or not, improper or not. Doesn't matter if there's chaperones. You really should not go to those dances, those balls, whatever. You need to stay away from them. You're never going to hear that kind of saint said that if you go to a New Order church. There's no way you will ever hear somebody say, "Oh yeah, such and such saint said one time that you shouldn't go to dances." Because many of the saints, if many people actually read their books, they were quite radical in some ways, sometimes in ways that were kind of funny. But they were very radical. You never heard about the radical aspects of the saints after Vatican II. You just heard about how they loved God and they loved Jesus and they loved their men and they were so into charity and things of that sort. And this was actually Bishop Williamson, who was consecrated by Archbishop Lefebvre, we'll talk about shortly, actually kind of made fun of this one time. In one of the interviews that he had, somebody asked him, what was Archbishop Lefebvre like as a person, like as a human being? What was he like? And Bishop Williamson said, making fun of all the kind of New Order Catholics who love to talk about how much God loves us and whatnot, said, he was nice, he was charitable. And it's kind of funny to hear a bishop say the word nice and charitable, and he pronounced them exactly like that, but he was kind of making fun of the notion that when people were talking about past people who were very holy or had exemplary qualities, none of them would actually talk about the very radical, drastic, almost kind of draconian things or almost kind of cynical mindsets that many of the saints had. They would just talk about how loving they were, how peaceful and how charitable they were, and they would never go into anything hard or strict. And that was a very big aspect of what eventually came to be called the spirit of Vatican II, was this big focus on loving God and loving Jesus and this and that and the other thing. They wouldn't talk about any of the firm, harsh guidelines that had to be followed. And Father Ripperger even joked about this, because I think he said it was one time his niece came home from church and she said, I'm sick of all the religion teachers talking about how much Jesus loves me. Because if you're a kid in a traditional Catholic church, or not a traditional Catholic, Novus Ordo church, that's all you ever heard. Jesus loves you so much, he wants to save you for your sins. You'll see some of these people in the annoying YouTube comment sections or bots or whatever saying like, Jesus Christ died for you, he wants to save you, repent and be saved. And that's not wrong, but it's just been overplayed so much, like good grief. Okay, anyway, I'm rambling about that too long. On to the next part. Okay, so following this, the lines between the traditionalist people with the traditionalist mindset and the New Order mindset kind of began to split. Now, what happened next, what we're going to discuss, is the Society of St. Pius X, or the SSPX. Love them, hate them, indifferent about them. These people were the main movers and shakers of the traditionalist movement, and they have to be discussed. A lot of people kind of try to go over them or gloss over them when discussing the traditional movement in Vatican II, but they cannot be glossed over because they were the main traditional force after Vatican II. Okay, so many of the seminarians who were in the churches or in training to become priests after Vatican II were distraught to learn about all the teachings of Vatican II or the spirit of Vatican II. They were horrified to see what was happening in the church, and they were terrified to learn that they would apparently not be able to say the traditional Mass. And that also brought up the question of, who are we going to be taking orders from? Because when a priest is ordained, he has to take orders from his bishop. But all the bishops had turned so liberal and progressive and worldly that many of these priests began to worry, okay, what's going to happen now? Who are we going to be taking orders from? These people who are allowing the nude masses and the clown masses and the gay masses and who knows what else? We can't take orders from these people. So they started digging deeper into Vatican II, and they found that a guy named Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre had been in charge of a small little traditional faction during Vatican II that had kind of tried to take the traditional stance during Vatican II. Quick backstory on Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. He was a French priest. He was born in France, grew up in France. Many of his siblings also ended up becoming either priests or nuns. When he first became a priest, he was briefly a parish priest, and then he became a missionary in Africa for the Holy Ghost Fathers. So for those of you who don't know what the Holy Ghost Fathers were, they would go into the wild, untamed areas of Africa and say Mass or hear confessions or perform weddings for people out there and so on and so forth. And what their general model was, what they would generally do was they'd have one like little headquarter area out in the middle of nowhere, and they'd have a bunch of little chapels set up, and then the priest would kind of go around to all those little chapels and the backwoods areas kind of and try to help the people out there. So they were actually very instrumental in converting many of the people in Africa to the Catholic faith. And he actually ended up staying in Africa during most of his tenure as a priest and then later a bishop. One key trait of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre that many people don't mention is that he was a very good organizer and leader. It seemed as though that guy could walk into the middle of the Gobi Desert. He could pretty much have walked into the middle of the Gobi Desert, snapped his fingers, and the next thing you know, there'd be Catholics everywhere, there'd be churches up and running, there'd be seminaries, there'd be hospitals, and so on and so forth. During his time in Africa, he built many churches, hospitals, seminaries, and he was just a very big mover and shaker, it seemed. And so they actually ended up the Pope ended up making him the Archbishop of Dakar in Africa. And they made him the Archbishop of that region specifically, I think, because there was only really one or two churches in it, and there were practically no Catholics. And sure enough, the next thing you knew, once they put him in charge there, soon the place was crawling full of Catholics. There were churches everywhere, hospitals, seminaries, and so on and so forth. So the seminarians really could not have picked anyone better to go to. So they went up to Archbishop Lefebvre, who was at this point, I believe, in his early 60s, and he was looking to retire. And they said, hi, they explained their situation to him, and he said, okay, well, I'll try and find somebody who might be able to help you out in some way, shape, or form. And one of the young seminarians blurted out, but Your Excellency, we want you. And the Archbishop was a little surprised by that, because normally seminarians are not supposed to talk to bishops that way, but he said, well, okay. So he went along with it, and he opened a seminary in a cone. He took over an abandoned seminary building, with the permission of the local bishop, by the way, and he started a little traditional seminary there. This new seminary in Econ, Switzerland, which Archbishop Lefebvre had opened with the permission of the local diocesan bishop in Switzerland, was the new headquarters of what would become the Society of St. Pius X, or SSPX for short. It seems kind of unclear what his original intentions were. Some people, I think I heard once, think that he only intended to train the seminarians for 2 years, give them a very basic understanding of tradition, and then send them off to another seminary somewhere. But as things began to ramp up within the church, he started to slowly change his mind. So, for example, let me check my notes here. Okay, so the seminary's formation was very similar to that of traditional seminaries prior to Vatican II. In other words, the Archbishop basically just copied the traditional formation of priests and implemented it. So the formation of priests had very much been changed after Vatican II to be a little more liberal and worldly, and the Archbishop basically just kept it the same. And in case you're wondering, yes, he only taught them the traditional Latin Mass. He did not teach them to say the new Mass at all whatsoever. And he didn't really make any remarks publicly about the new Mass at this point. He didn't really fight the Pope or the Vatican. He was just kind of quietly working in the background to keep his little seminary going. Though he did receive word eventually from the Vatican that the Vatican would be sending 2 officials to inspect the seminary. And so the Archbishop remarked to one of his friends about this upcoming visit, quote, I well suspected that our refusal to accept the new Mass would sooner or later be a stumbling block, but I would have preferred to die rather than to confront Rome and the Pope, end quote. And so this visit was very interesting by the 2 Vatican officials, and this quote is taken from the SSPX's website. Quote, for 3 days, the 2 Belgians, the visitors from the Vatican, would question the priests and seminarians and make theologically questionable remarks to them. They, the Vatican officials, thought the ordination of married men was normal and inevitable. They did not admit that truth is immutable, and they expressed doubts concerning the physical reality of Christ's resurrection. They never went to chapel, and when they left, offered no report of their visit for Archbishop Lefebvre to sign. Okay, so that right there just shows you how weird this whole situation was becoming. So a lot of people will say about Vatican II, oh, well, it was mostly okay. There were a couple of hiccups here and there, but for the most part, everything was okay. The bishops were well-intentioned. Things were going well. No, these people quite literally said that they thought that married men were going to get ordained soon, and they expressed doubts about Christ's resurrection and the certainty of absolute truth. And just to reiterate this, these are not 2 regular priests. This is not a group of 2 priests from some place way out in the middle of the backwoods and nowhere who just happened to pop into the seminary for a quick visit. These are the official inspectors from Rome, in charge of visiting seminaries to make sure that they're up to code. So these official inspectors pop into a seminary and casually say that many of the truths of the Catholic Church aren't necessarily truths of the Catholic Church, and then they leave. That's the equivalent of somebody showing up to inspect a Navy ship. They find out that, and then they drop little things while they're there, like saying like, oh yeah, the ship doesn't necessarily have to be waterproof. It's okay if we've got a few leaks here and there. Or saying things like, yeah, it's okay if guns don't work on Navy ships. They don't really have to work. It's just nice if they do. They don't really have to be like that. Well, that's not the greatest analogy, but it just kind of goes to show you just how horrible this was. So the Archbishop Lefebvre's kind of warning antenna perk up here. He's like, oh shoot, I knew it was bad, but I didn't realize it was this bad. And the reports just kept flowing in. You heard about people who weren't even Catholics being ordained priests. You heard people saying that, as has already been said, ecumenism, that people didn't have to be converted to Catholicism. You heard things about the popes, such as Pope John Paul II, who eventually ended up coming in saying things like Hindus and Islam were all valid religions, and so on and so forth. So the traditionalists were getting quite worried at this point about the direction that the Vatican was heading in. And they were really kind of starting to create, and they weren't creating enemies in the Vatican, but the Vatican was getting kind of angry with them. So, for example, a lady from the diocese came to see Bishop Adam and said to him on November 11th, quote, "Now I only want the Mass of St. Pius V. I'm going to Icone," end quote. And Icone was where the SSPX seminary was. The bishop replied coldly, quote, "I wouldn't bother. In any case, the unity of the church will soon be sorted out," end quote. And so it says that Archbishop Lefebvre left for Rome on November 16th to try to smooth things over with the Vatican. And on November 21st, while he was visiting, one of the Swiss guards who broke formation, he broke his bearing and said, "Your Excellency, you don't actually expect anything from these people, do you?" And soon after this, when Archbishop Lefebvre realized just how far off the rails the Vatican was now going, he published his famous 1974 declaration. I'm not going to read the full thing here because that would take too long, but I'll read you just the most important part. Quote, "Our backs are against the wall and we have to make a choice. Without rebelling, we choose the beliefs and practices of the Church of all time. Consequently, we adhere with our whole heart and with our whole soul to Catholic Rome, the guardian of the Catholic faith and of those traditions necessary for the maintenance of the faith, to eternal Rome, mistress of wisdom and truth. Because of this adherence, we refuse, and have always refused, to follow the Rome of neo-modernist and neo-Protestant tendencies, such as were clearly manifested during the Second Vatican Council and after the Council in all the resulting reforms." It says that the Archbishop had not even finished reading his declaration when the seminarians, aware of the importance of the moment, began to applaud him. And the Archbishop went on to meet 3 cardinals on February 13th to continue discussing what was happening at Icone. Especially concerning the inspection that had recently taken place. And one of the cardinals, Cardinal Garone, said, quote, "The visitors' report is very favorable, but they caught a whiff of opposition to the Council and the Pope. Look here. Your declaration confirms this suspicion. You are against the Pope and the Council." And it says Archbishop Lefebvre countered that by saying, "What about the new heterodox catechisms, and the new Mass, which is none other than the Mass of Luther, and openness to communism, and the Freemasons who are not excommunicated, and religious liberty that puts all religions on the same footing?" And soon after, Archbishop Lefebvre was ordered by the Vatican to shut down the Icone Seminary. And this is the first big step, because beforehand, the Archbishop Lefebvre and the traditionalists and the Vatican had kind of disagreed on things. But now Archbishop Lefebvre is being ordered to suspend the seminary, and he's actually going to refuse. And in his official refusal, he states, quote, "Asking us to close the seminary at Icone means asking us to take part in the destruction of the Church. When the good Lord calls me, I don't want to say in my conscience, 'Well, I have destroyed something that the good Lord allowed me to do through his providence, and which besides had canonical permission, and was practically approved by the Roman visitors. I am asked to destroy all that because it does not follow the post-conciliar tendencies that are destroying the Church. Well, no." End quote. Now, during this time, the SSPX had actually grown and expanded somewhat rapidly as for a order that was really quite so new. So remember how it was said earlier on in the video that Archbishop Lefebvre was very good when he was in Africa, just snapping his fingers and making seminaries and whatnot pop up everywhere. Yeah, this was no exception. Pretty soon the SSPX had seminaries all across Europe, North and South America, and they had priests everywhere. And they still followed the same model that Archbishop Lefebvre had followed in Africa. They would ordain some priests. They would have them establish a little priory somewhere. They'd rent or build some little chapels in different areas across the United States and Europe and everywhere else that they had SSPX priests. And then on Sundays, these priests would go out and say masses pretty much all across the country. And people would drive, traditionalists would drive several hours oftentimes to get to these masses. Like, even today, many times when people are interested in attending a Latin Mass, they'll say, oh, wow, the Latin Mass is over an hour away from me. And other traditionalists will say, hey, consider yourself lucky. We drive 2 to 3 hours to get to the traditional Latin Mass. The lengths that the Catholics are willing to go to attend the traditional Mass cannot be overstated. And there were quite a few reasons for this, but the main reason was most of the Catholics weren't really too interested in church politics, so to speak. They just wanted to attend an Orthodox Mass, and at the time, if you wanted to attend an Orthodox Mass, pretty much the SSPX Masses were your only bet. For example, Bishop Williamson, who I mentioned earlier, who eventually ended up becoming a priest and later a bishop at the SSPX, was originally not a traditional Catholic, and he had no intention of becoming a traditional Catholic. He was a New Order Catholic attending the new Mass. He was very happy there. His priest, who he greatly trusted, Father Flanagan, was also a New Order Catholic. And, Father Flanagan actually told Bishop, then Mr. Williamson, you should think about becoming a priest. Try going to this seminary here and see if they accept you. So then Mr. Williamson went to that seminary to try out, and he was greeted by 3 people on the interviewing panel. 1 priest, 1 layman, and 1 lay woman. And for those of you who don't understand why that's such a big deal, because traditionally, only priests would interview potential priests about whether or not they were suited for the priesthood, because only the priest can fully understand what the priesthood is about, especially not a layman, and certainly not a lay woman. To top that off, the lay woman actually asked the then Mr. Williamson whether or not he could stand the celibate life. And for those of you who don't understand why that's quite so creepy, flip the sexes for a minute. Imagine that an 18-year-old girl is going in to interview to become a nun. She's greeted by 1 nun, 1 lay woman, and 1 layman. Now imagine that the man asks the 18-year-old girl if she thinks that she will be able to stay chaste throughout her whole life without being married to a man. Now you can kind of see why that's so creepy. So Mr. Williamson went back to Father Flanagan. Father Flanagan sent him off to another place. Pretty much the same thing happened. So Father Flanagan at that point said, young man, there's only one place for you, and that's a cone. And Father Flanagan actually did not like Archbishop Lefebvre. He thought that Archbishop Lefebvre was, rebellious. He was being too stubborn. He needed to just get in line and go with what the Pope said. But he said, look, this guy's going to make a great priest. All of the other seminaries are simply too liberal to have him, so I'm sending him off to a cone. And that was the boat that many of the traditional Catholics found themselves in and still find themselves in. They don't necessarily want to be disobedient to the Pope or to the Vatican or whatnot, but if you wanted to attend a traditional Mass, you really just didn't have much of a choice. The SSPX was your only option. And so because of that, the number of traditional Catholics attending the SSPX continued to grow and grow and grow. Now remember, the Archbishop started the SSPX when he was in his 60s, and now he was getting older and older, and I think he had cancer by that point. He knew he was probably going to die soon. So he wanted to consecrate, new bishops to carry on his work. For those of you who don't understand why that's important, only bishops can consecrate new priests and perform the sacrament of confirmation. So up until this point, Archbishop Lefebvre had been ordaining all the new priests for the society, and he had been performing the sacrament of confirmation for all of them. Now the problem was, if he dies, there are going to be no more priests, because there's going to be no more bishops to ordain them, because of course the Vatican doesn't want new traditional priests to be ordained, and the traditional children aren't going to have a bishop to perform the sacrament of confirmation for them. So Archbishop Lefebvre needed to consecrate new bishops. Now the problem is, technically, an archbishop, or any kind of bishop for that matter, is not allowed to consecrate a new bishop without the express permission of the Pope, or basically without approval from the Vatican, meaning he has to submit a name, get a stamp of approval on it, and then he can go ahead and consecrate him. But we all know by this point that the Vatican didn't necessarily like Archbishop Lefebvre all that much. They hadn't been declared mortal enemies or anything like that, but he had still refused to shut down the seminary, and they were kind of sour. Nevertheless, Archbishop Lefebvre went in and met with the cardinals of the Vatican, most notably Cardinal Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict XVI, and they discussed consecrating new bishops. So they haggled over it for a while, and finally Ratzinger said, okay, I'll tell you what, you can consecrate one bishop. Now Archbishop Lefebvre had wanted to consecrate three. Two for Europe, so that they could speak both French and English, and one for North America. And so he kind of said, oh, okay, well, one's better than none. Okay, can I consecrate him in a couple of months? And Cardinal Ratzinger said, oh, no, that's far too soon. We need some more time for that. And Archbishop Lefebvre said, okay, well, then can I consecrate him several more months from now in the summer? No, that's far too soon. Okay, well, how about the autumn? No, that's far too soon. Okay, how about next December, next winter, almost a full year from now? And Cardinal Ratzinger said, I don't know, I'll have to get back to you on that one. And at that point, Archbishop Lefebvre said, wait a minute, are you just all waiting for me to die? Because the Vatican had no intention of actually giving him a date on which he could consecrate any bishops. They just kept pushing it out and delaying and dawdling, hoping that the old man would die before anything else could happen, and then they would hear the last of the SSPX. So the Archbishop wrestled for this for a bit because, what's he supposed to do? Is he supposed to disobey the Pope and consecrate bishops anyway? What's going to happen to him if he does that? A bishop can't just disobey the Pope on a whim, but at the same time, if he doesn't consecrate new bishops and they're not letting him consecrate new bishops, then everything here that he worked for at the SSPX is going to just kind of dissipate. Now, during this time, things in the church just continued to get worse. Most notably, John Paul II was now the Pope, and he was not the greatest Pope, so to speak. So a lot of the conservative Catholics think that John Paul II is the greatest person to have ever walked the earth. He was a wonderful man. He was like the perfect saint and whatnot. John Paul II taught universal salvation, that all men will be saved. John Paul II taught that the Holy Ghost is responsible for non-Christian religions. John Paul II visited a Buddhist temple and said how excited he was to meet, quote, His Holiness, the Supreme Buddhist Patriarch in the temple, end quote. On February 2nd, 1986, John Paul II received on his forehead the tilak or tika, the red powdery paste of the Hindus, the sign of recognition of the adorers of Shiva, or Shiva, however it's pronounced. John Paul II venerated the Hindu Gandhi. On October 27th, 1986, John Paul II invited major world leaders of all false religions to come to Assisi for a World Day of Prayer for Peace. John Paul II, quote-unquote, prayed with over 100 different religious leaders of various false religions, and he basically this was a smack in the face to all Catholics right here. Because the Catholic Church has said for over 2,000 years, you cannot pray with other members of false religions. Now, so what does that mean? Okay, so that means that a Protestant and a Catholic cannot stand together and pray to God together. That means a Muslim and a Catholic are not allowed, according to Catholic rules, to stand together and pray to God together. Why? Because Catholicism is the only true religion. If you pray publicly or privately with members of another false religion, you are basically more or less saying that their religion is valid. You might disagree with that, you might not like that, but that is what the Catholic Church has taught for well over 2,000 years. So when John Paul II at Assisi brings well over 100 different religious leaders and publicly stands up to pray with all of them, that's a slap in the face to Catholicism. So many people try to explain this away or say like, oh yeah, John Paul II, he wasn't perfect, but he had some good parts. He just made a couple mistakes here and there. No, that's not some small mistake. The Pope does not accidentally invite 100 heads of religions to Assisi and then publicly stand up on an altar and pray with them all. That's absurd. Oh, good grief. This entire idea was all John Paul II's idea. He didn't stop there. During his time at Assisi, during this gathering of all of these 100 leaders of false religions, John Paul II had a statue of Buddha placed on the tabernacle at Assisi. That's what an incredible slap in the face towards God right there. John Paul II also sponsored pagan prayer meetings at Kyoto in 1987, Rome in 1988, Warsaw in 1989, Bari in 1990, and Malta in 1991, as well as numerous meetings after 1991. He was blessed in a pagan ritual by an Indian shaman in 1987. He played with African witch doctors in 1985, and he said about that meeting, quote, "Particularly noteworthy was the prayer meeting at the sanctuary of Our Lady of Mercy at Lake Togo, where for the first time I also prayed with a group of animists, which are the witch doctors." Oh, good grief. In Cotonou, in Africa, on February 4th, 1993, chanting girls treated John Paul II to a quote-unquote trance-inducing voodoo dance. On May the 14th of 1999, John Paul II bowed to and kissed the Quran. On March 21st, 2000, he said, quote, "May St. John the Baptist protect Islam and all the people of Jordan," end quote. Jordan, the great Umayyad Mosque of Damascus. While in the mosque, John Paul II took off his shoes out of reverence for this temple of infidelity. John Paul II half taught that Muslims and Catholics have the same God. He joined the Jewish community in commemorating the 100th anniversary of the synagogue. So yeah, we can go on and on. He taught that schismatics don't need to be converted. He bestowed the pectoral cross on the head of the Anglican sect. And in October of 1983, he said, speaking of Martin Luther, quote, "Our world even today experiences his great impact on history," and he praised John Calvin, as one who is, quote, "trying to make the church more faithful to the will of God," end quote. So yeah, to put it quite simply, the traditionalists and John Paul II did not get along very well. I know that if you're a conservative, you've probably been told that John Paul II was the greatest man ever, and you're probably shocked to hear all of this, but he really was not that great of a guy. Okay, so to put it quite simply, John Paul II had no intention of letting Archbishop Lefebvre consecrate any bishops for the SSPX. There was no way this was going to happen. So, what Archbishop Lefebvre eventually did is he decided to go ahead and consecrate some of the bishops anyway. So how is he going to do that? How is he supposed to go ahead and just consecrate bishops anyway without the Pope's permission? He was going to do so using a certain caveat in the kind of an emergency clause known as the state of necessity. Okay, so what's a state of necessity? There are many rules in traditional Catholicism that are quite ironclad, but can be waived away in certain times, or there are exemptions to them. So, for example, only a priest or a deacon is technically allowed to baptize someone in the Catholic Church. So, for example, friendly old Grandpa Joe can't baptize your baby. Friendly old neighbor Bill down the road can't baptize your baby. Only a priest or a deacon can do that. However, there are certain times this rule can be waived. So, for example, let's say it's a time of war and somebody, a soldier is shot and dying in the field, and he tells a Catholic in the army, I think I want to be baptized quick, and the guy's about to die in like 5 seconds, there's no time left. In that case, the Catholic can invoke what's called a state of necessity. It's basically an emergency situation, and he can baptize that person, that soldier in the field, as a Catholic. And technically, what Archbishop Lefebvre had been doing with the SSPX is they've been invoking the state of necessity because they said that, technically speaking, Catholics cannot be denied the traditional sacraments. So remember, the bishops had all said, okay, we're getting rid of the traditional Latin Mass. Nobody's allowed to say it anymore. And a lot of people would say, okay, that's it. If the Pope and the bishops say the traditional Latin Mass is over, then it's over. There's nothing we can do about it. And Archbishop Lefebvre and the SSPX said, not so fast. And they pointed back to Pro Quimum, which I mentioned earlier, which was written by Pope Pius V. And I have a couple of quotes from Pro Quimum I'm going to read for you here. Quote, "Let all everywhere adopt and observe what has been handed down by the Holy Roman Church, the mother and teacher of the other churches, and let masses not be sung or read according to any other formula than that of this missal published by us. This ordinance applies henceforth, now and forever, throughout all the provinces of the Christian world, to all patriarchs, cathedral churches, collegiate and parish churches, be they secular or religious, both of men and of women, even of military orders, and of churches or chapels with a specific congregation, in which conventual masses are sung aloud in choir, or read privately in according with the rites and customs of the Roman Church. And here he continues on, therefore, no one whosoever is permitted to alter this notice of our permission, statute, ordinance, command, precept, grant, indult, declaration, will, decree, and prohibition. Would anyone, however, presume to commit such an act, he should know that he will incur the wrath of Almighty God and of the blessed apostles Peter and Paul. End quote. So if you'll remember earlier, I had said that pro primum codified the traditional Mass. It basically enshrined it. And here in this document, Pope Pius V, is quite clearly saying nobody can get rid of this. We're enshrining this traditional Mass. Everybody has a right to it. Every Catholic has a right to it. We're never getting rid of it. It's never going to be abrogated. So Archbishop Lefebvre and the traditionalists insisted that because of quo primum, they had a right to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass and provide the lay faithful with the traditional Latin Mass. And the Pope and the bishops, they didn't exactly counter that, but they strongly kind of insisted or hinted that the traditionalists just needed to shut up and do whatever the Pope and the Vatican said. And so then you kind of had these warring factions. On one hand, the Catholics had been told their entire lives, just do whatever the Pope and the bishops say. But at the same time, they'd also been told that they needed to attend Mass and honor God through the ceremonies and customs of the traditional Latin Mass, however they could. And now all of a sudden the traditional Latin Mass has been taken away from them. So, which side are you going to go with here? So what the SSPX priests had been doing is normally, if a priest wants to say Mass in a particular diocese, he has to actually go ask the bishop of that diocese. So for example, you can't just go build a church somewhere, throw a priest in it, and now you're good to go. The priest actually has to go and ask the permission from the bishop of that diocese to say Mass there. And most of the bishops had said no to the SSPX, and so what the SSPX priests had done is they said, well, we have a right, according to quo primum, to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass, and there are no other traditional Latin Masses being offered in the diocese, and the laity have a right to attend the traditional Latin Mass. So we're going to declare a state of necessity or a state of emergency here, basically, and go ahead and construct the churches anyway. And that's what they did. So Archbishop Lefebvre invoked the same defense here. He said, we need priests because the laity have a right to have access to the traditional Mass, and so I'm going to go ahead and consecrate bishops. And that's what he did in Icone in 1988. And that is where the claims of the SSPX being quote-unquote schismatic come from. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into the details here, but basically, schismatic people are people who have completely cut themselves off from the Catholic Church and from the Pope's authority. So, for example, when Martin Luther broke away from the Catholic Church and declared that Catholicism was flawed, he was being schismatic because he was breaking himself off from the customs, teachings, and traditions of the Catholic Church. When the Orthodox broke off from the Catholic Church, they were being schismatic because they broke off from the teaching, traditions, and customs of Catholicism. Now, when the SSPX said, we're not going to follow the Vatican's directive here because Catholics have a right to the traditional Mass, a lot of people immediately threw the schismatic label at them. Now, most of the popes have, since then, especially Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis, have clarified that the SSPX is not in schism because they never formally broke away from Catholicism. All of their priests are still Catholic priests. They're all still valid. And they're actually on good terms with many bishops around the world today, but the schismatic label is still one that follows them around everywhere, even though many Vatican officials have officially said that they aren't in schism. That still just doesn't stop anybody who dislikes the traditionalists from hurling the schismatic label at them. Now, right after the consecrations occurred, John Paul II issued a document stating that technically the four bishops who Archbishop Lefebvre consecrated and Archbishop Lefebvre himself had all technically excommunicated themselves. Now, this is a key detail because what many people will say is John Paul II excommunicated them. He didn't excommunicate them technically according to the old customs. See, in the old customs, and something that you'll see if you watch that movie Becket, though the excommunication process in there is a bit flawed, technically the bishop, if somebody is being excommunicated, the bishop or the pope stands up and says, I formally declare that so-and-so is excommunicated. I exclude him from our Holy Mother Church, and I cast him into hell with Satan and all of his minions, and so on. And I declare that he has cut himself off, and since he's not willing to repent, he's done, he's out, he's gone. It's very explicit. John Paul II didn't do that. What John Paul II did is he released a document saying technically what they did was a mortal sin, so technically they are excommunicated, which is very, very different from standing up formally in public and saying, yes, I solemnly declare that this person is excommunicated, I am casting them, they are done. I'm casting them out, they're done, they have no affiliation with me. Now, soon after the 1988 consecrations happened, the traditionalist camp was split, and it was kind of inevitable because everybody had different opinions on how to handle the aftermath of Vatican II. But what basically happened, the main important thing that happened is the Ecclesia Dei Communities. So some of the priests, not many, I think it was about 8 or so. Was it 4? It might have been 4 priests and 8 seminarians. I'm not sure I have the numbers right. But regardless, they broke away from the Society of St. Pius X and they approached John Paul II and they said, hi, we still want to keep the traditional Mass and we want to basically be a second SSPX, but we want to submit to your authority and just do whatever we want. Archbishop Lefebvre kept standing up to you. We don't want to do that anymore. And the Vatican didn't exactly want any more traditional groups, but they realized that if these priests didn't get permission from the Vatican, then they were just going to become a second SSPX and they were going to defy the Vatican. So they pretty much just shrugged and said, well, better to have this group under our control than out of our control. So they went ahead and signed the papers. Now, the one thing that the priests did request is they said, can we please have a bishop for our new community or group that we're forming? And the Vatican officials said, yes, oh, of course. Just like we promised Archbishop Lefebvre a bishop, we'll give you a bishop. Don't you worry. Just do exactly what we say and we'll give you a bishop. Yeah, that was about 50 years ago, well over 50 years ago now, or getting close to 50 years ago, and they still have not had a bishop, ever. They've never been given a bishop. That group was called the Fraternity of St. Peter, and they've still never been given a bishop. And other groups like this kind of formed suit. The Institute of Christ the King was also formed, but neither of these organizations ever came to rival the immense power or influence that the SSPX has. For a couple of very simple reasons. One is that both of these groups, the Fraternity of St. Peter, the Institute of Christ the King, and any group affiliated with the Ecclesia Dei Community, that was the organization created by the Vatican to oversee these groups, has to agree and sign papers stating that Vatican II was A-OK. There was nothing wrong with it. So the SSPX insisted that Vatican II, specifically the documents on collegiality, religious liberty, ecumenism, and the New Order Mass, all had problems with them. And the SSPX priests flat out refused to celebrate the New Order Mass. They said, we're not going to have anything to do with this Mass. We're not even going to encourage our lay people to attend it. We're going to tell them to stay away because it's so Protestant and so evil that they genuinely should not stay away. It is valid. It is valid, but we can't encourage the people to go to something that was designed by Freemasons and by Protestants for Protestants. This is horrible. This is a decimation of the Mass. The Fraternity of St. Peter people said, we're going to go ahead and encourage people to attend the Mass anyway if they don't have a traditional Latin Mass. So the SSPX's stance was everything associated with Vatican II is evil and needs to be they need to do away with it. They need to sign some papers saying, sorry, that was a horrible mistake, we're getting rid of all of it. Whereas the Fraternity of St. Peter priests, even if they kind of privately don't like some of it, they just try to keep their mouths shut and just try to offer the traditional Mass kind of on the side. So the SSPX priests want the New Order Mass and everything associated with Vatican II to be completely done away with and destroyed, whereas the Fraternity of St. Peter and the other Ecclesia Dei Communities just kind of want to offer the traditional Mass on the side for the people who would like it. Go ahead and keep the New Order stuff and the Vatican II stuff, but just let us have our little traditional Masses on the side over here, out of sight, out of mind. The second reason that the SSPX is far larger is because they claim a state of necessity whenever they're building new churches. So even if the bishops in the area don't like them, and many bishops today are very untraditional and don't like the traditional movement, the SSPX will go ahead and build a church there anyway. So, for example, if there's an area that has many no traditional masses anywhere, the bishop won't allow traditional masses, the SSPX will go ahead and set up shop there, whereas the Fraternity of St. Peter will be helpless. Even if the Fraternity of St. Peter or Institute of Christ the King want to go ahead and set up a church there, if the bishop says, no, not happening, then that's it. They don't get to do anything. And even in the few dioceses, at least in the United States, where the Fraternity of St. Peter has been allowed to set up shop, they are constantly trying to fend off problems from the bishops. So, for example, the bishops will actually only allow the Fraternity of St. Peter to set up shop oftentimes in cities where the SSPX already is. So, what's a good example of that? Take Idaho. The SSPX has multiple chapels set up throughout Idaho, but their most famous kind of base of operations in Idaho is in Post Falls, Idaho. They have schools there, they have a giant church there, and they have a very strong presence in that area. So the Fraternity of St. Peter approached the Bishop of Idaho and said, may we please set up churches in Idaho? Now, the Bishop of Idaho does not like traditionalists at all. He didn't like traditionalists. But he realized, oh, if I let the Fraternity of St. Peter set up shop in Post Falls, maybe they can help draw some of the traditionalists away from the SSPX and into them, and then I can control them a little bit more. So he said, you're not allowed to set up churches anywhere in Idaho with one exception. You're allowed to set them up in Post Falls. So what happened, and this is part of the reason why the SSPX and some of the Ecclesia Dei communities don't like each other, is because for the first several years of their existence, the Fraternity of St. Peter would try to set up shop wherever the SSPX priests already were, and they would basically just try to draw away people from the SSPX. That's a very big difference between the two groups. Also, the SSPX's idea of obedience is, if the order given is generally good and it's not going to hurt or harm our faith, we'll go along with it. On the other hand, if it is going to hurt or harm our faith, then we're going to ignore it. So, for example, when it comes to elections, sometimes, or something like that, the SSPX will feel a little more free about sometimes warning the people, you can't vote for somebody who's fine with abortion, or you can't do anything that is anti-Catholic, whereas the Fraternity of St. Peter kind of has to keep their mouth shut. So, for example, during COVID, I think in Germany, there was a famous priest named Father Maudsley for the Fraternity of St. Peter, and he was told, you're supposed to shut down your masses. And because the German bishop has ordered us, and the Austrian bishops have all ordered us, shut down the masses. And he didn't like that, and that actually got him into quite a bit of trouble with the Fraternity of St. Peter priests and bishops. Similarly, what was it? When Pope Francis released Traditionis Custodes, trying to limit all of the traditional Latin masses, the SSPX just kind of shrugged and said, whatever, we're not going to pay any attention to that, whereas the FSSP basically freaked out, because that could mean that they would be shut down at any point in time. And of course, as I'm sure you're well aware, if Pope Francis or anybody else at the Vatican does something bad, the SSPX feels fine going ahead and warning everybody that what Pope Francis did was not allowed, whereas the Fraternity of St. Peter is so hinged on the Vatican that they have to shut down any priests who say anything even somewhat negative about the Pope. So, for example, a bit back, Pope Francis had the whole Pachamama debacle. For those of you who don't remember the Pachamama debacle, he took an idol, a South American idol, into the Vatican and basically worshipped it with several other people, and actually planted idol trees associated with the idol itself in the Vatican gardens. Similarly, he attended like some kind of ritual to like a Western grandma, like of Native American religion, and actually like participated in the ritual himself, while somebody like tried to summon the spirit of the Western grandma into the room. Now, when these kind of things happen, the SSPX went around telling all of their parishioners, hey, just so you know, the Pope worshiping idols, yeah, that's a bad thing. He did something bad. Don't think that's good. Don't think that's normal. You need to avoid it. What did the Fraternity of St. Peter priests do? Nothing. You know why they didn't say or do anything to warn their lay people that what Pope Francis had done was bad? Because if they said anything bad about the Pope, there were going to be repercussions from the Vatican, and they knew it. So really, I don't want to be rude to the Fraternity of St. Peter. I like Father Ripperger, and he was a Fraternity of St. Peter priest, but these guys are basically just under the Vatican's little finger, and they are completely helpless when it comes to actually standing up to the evils or modernism in the church. It's really quite a sad situation. Now, on top of that, Pope Benedict XVI eventually ended up releasing the 4 bishops and Marcel Lefebvre posthumously from the excommunications. And he released his own document stating that the traditional Latin Mass had never been abrogated, so now technically the traditional priest still alive anywhere in any diocese, as long as the bishop allowed it, could continue to say the traditional Mass. But then when Pope Francis came in, he basically tried to reverse that, and you've had lots of little infighting since then. So where it currently stands is you've got several different kinds of traditionalists. You have the diocesan traditionalists. They're a bit of a mixed bag. They've often just discovered the traditional Latin Mass and they think it looks pretty, but they don't usually know too much more beyond that. Sometimes they have a little bit of understanding of Vatican II, but they have the conservative mindset of obey the Pope now, no matter what beaten into them, so they're kind of afraid to go too far beyond that. Next, you have the Fraternity of St. Peter people, and they, like I said earlier, most of them just want to go to Mass and be left alone and hope that the Pope doesn't bother them that much. And they just, for the most part, they just try to attend the traditional Mass, stay in the traditional Mass as much as possible, avoid the Novus Ordo, but they don't really go too far beyond that. And if the bishops or the popes in that area, or the Pope ever decide to step on them, then they're pretty much helpless. Next up, you've got the SSPX traditionalists. They generally want the Novus Ordo and everything associated with Vatican II to be wiped aside, and they won't be satisfied until that happens. So, yeah, they're not going to stop anytime soon. They're probably not going to accept many agreements or deals. They're going to be here for quite a while. They have hundreds of parishes everywhere, all across the world, and they're not going away anytime soon. Last but not least, you have the, I think they roughly call the Resistance. It's roughly headed by Bishop Williamson, who split away from the SSPX because one of the bishops in charge of the SSPX, named Bishop Pillay, kept trying to make a deal with Rome and compromise, and Bishop Williamson didn't like that so much, so Bishop Pillay kicked him out. And Bishop Williamson has his own tiny little group, but he's not really too interested in expanding it or trying to become some dominant, powerful force, so it stayed pretty small. And last but not least, you have the Sedevacantists. Not really quite sure whether to include them in this or not, but basically they say no heretic is ever allowed to be the Pope, and pretty much all the popes during and since Vatican II have held heretical beliefs, so none of them are the popes, and basically the chair of Peter is vacant. Not too many people take the Sedevacantist side. Generally, in terms of manpower, I believe it's the SSPX completely beats everybody else. Then you kind of have the Fraternity of St. Peter next, maybe the Sedevacantists, and then the Institute of Christ the King is next. Or no, the Diocesan Catholics would probably be next, and Institute of Christ the King has the least number of people. And that's currently where things stand today. So I kind of hope that you like that very, very rough and brief version. If there's something you think I missed in there, understand that I've been talking for like well over an hour now, and if I kept mentioning every little detail associated with something like Vatican II or a group being formed, then this would have gone on for several days easily. So there's only really so much I can fit into it. So the SSPX is definitely different from the other groups in that it is the first group, the original group, and it firmly opposes the New Order Mass and everything associated with Vatican II, and the only other group besides the SSPX that can claim to hold to those same principles is the Resistance, which is Bishop Williamson's group. Now, the one claim that the SSPX does have over all the other groups is that it was the first and original group, and none of the other groups would have existed without it. So, for example, many Catholics will say something like, well, I like the traditional Mass and I like attending the traditional Latin Mass, but I'm fine with just attending the diocesan Mass. I don't want to have to be associated with the SSPX. But what they often fail to realize is that if it was not for the SSPX, the diocesan Masses and the Ecclesia Dei Masses, such as the Fraternity of St. Peter Masses, would not exist. Because remember, the Vatican did not want there to be diocesan Masses or Ecclesia Dei Masses, but they gave in and let those groups be created in order to try to draw away from the Mass attendees at the SSPX chapels. So if for whatever reason the SSPX just disappeared off the face of the earth tomorrow, the Vatican would in all probability be allowed to or would try to wipe out all the other traditional Masses. And that you can actually see that in some of the dioceses where they banned the Latin Masses. They only banned the Latin Masses, especially in dioceses where there were no SSPX churches nearby. In other dioceses where there were SSPX chapels nearby, they sometimes closed down some of the churches, but they tried to keep many of the other chapels open.